Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for getting back on time. I hope everyone had a refreshing lunch break, some fresh air, enjoyed the delights of the food, and more importantly, perhaps got a chance to network and speak to some of the audience here today. So thank you for staying for this afternoon as well. I'm very respectful, as you said at the start of today, with your time. So we've got a really packed agenda to take us through to networking drinks at 5 o'clock. And we're going to kick off the next session on a topic that I know is dear to many of us, the topic of sustainable IT and how do we as leaders or practitioners in our industries and organizations innovate sustainably, following on from some of the themes we heard this morning around the need to move fast at scale, innovate in the world of compliance, but how do we do that sustainably? And I'm delighted to host a session now with 3 leaders who are kind of leading the charge in the industries on this topic. 2 of them are board members of sustainableIT.org that Jed mentioned in his keynote this morning, which is a non-profit organization that Jed and our Chief Marketing Officer, Josh, are part of. But most importantly, it's a community of leaders who are trying to drive that change around sustainable IT. So without further ado, I would ask you to give a big, well, let me just introduce who's speaking first, and then we'll give them a big round of applause. I'm delighted that Niklas Sundberg is joining us, who's the Senior Vice President and CIO of ASSA ABLOY Global Solutions. We have Rainer Karcher, who's the Global Head of Sustainability of Allianz Technology, and Wiebren van der Zer, who is the Head of Sustainability of IT at ABN AMRO. So please give me a big warm round of applause. Come in, grab a seat. And before we start, we're going to play a video.
We needed something like a playbook for busy technologists to be able to easily comprehend and to enable them to get started on their sustainable IT journey. CIOs has a great role to play within this. I believe firmly if we're going to curb the climate crisis, we're going to need technology that's available today, but also technology that needs to be developed down the road. And we as CIOs can unlock that opportunity within the business, for example. But while we do that, we also need to make sure that we deliver IT in a sustainable way. In terms of getting started, I would say that the most important factor is to become data-driven. You need to understand where you're coming from. What's your emission baseline? Once you have established your mission baseline, then you can start dissecting what are my impact areas where we can make a sustainable impact. The empowerment and engagement from your employees, it's really about activating them, to enable them to come on this journey, but not making that hard for them to come on this journey. We have created a sustainable IT dashboard, and where we have our different impact areas, and we are very openly sharing our progress and also showing our employees what are the key areas where they can, together with us, make a difference. And what we do internally is that we empower our employees, we train them, and we create new opportunities to get involved and to be part of this journey.
Excellent. Great introduction. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Why don't we start, if that's okay, Niklas, maybe, and all of you, just give a brief introduction on your good selves and your background and perhaps your passion around this topic today.
Yes, so Niklas Sundberg, Senior Vice President and CEO for ASSA ABLOY Global Solutions division. So you'll probably get in contact with us in your everyday life when you are running on the tram, access control and so forth. Digital identities is sort of our key things, digital passports and digital identities going forward. Been a consultant for 15 years and been with ASSA ABLOY for the last 6 years, coming into my 7th year. And my passion really around this is that when I started developing our own IT strategy and our own sustainable IT strategy internally to sort of align with our overall goals within ASSA ABLOY, I also realized that there isn't really a playbook, there's not really a good starting point for technology leaders to get started. And that sort of fed the idea to create a book where Rainer has been part of contributing to as well.
Thank you, Niklas. Welcome again. Rainer?
Thank you.
Yeah, nice segue. Thank you for that, Niklas. I'm Rainer. I'm heading sustainability in Allianz Technology since October last year. So sustainability in the biggest insurance company of the world does mean about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions is coming from digital. So we don't have any factories, we don't have any products, and that means that the importance of what I'm driving within Allianz is quite heavily seen. So I do have a huge important aspect in 3 main pillars, which you probably have seen already in Niklas' book, which is our own footprint. So what can we do to reduce whatever is being operated digital? Secondly, it's about the handprint. So where is IT, where is digitalization in the combination of a transformational aspect being useful and helpful to drive automation, for example, to reduce the aspect of manual work or paper, which is quite a heavy thing for us in the insurance world. And third of all, it's the CSR aspect, so whatever we do to help the society, so where digital is helping, for example, on accessibility aspects, inclusion, all that things are with me since October. Before that, I used to work at Siemens within the same role for about roughly 2.5 years, but in total I'm in IT for 25 years. So I'm an IT person through and through. And if you search me on LinkedIn, you'll find me as climate activist in a suit. So the activism comes from exactly driving things out of a big enterprise, out of a big company.
Thank you, Rainer. I think last time I met Rainer, we were at Oktoberfest in Munich in Germany, where we were standing on the table talking about sustainable IT. So today I'm hoping to do a poor imitation of a chat show host, and no German beer today, sadly. And welcome again.
Thank you.
And Wiebren, your good self.
Yeah, good afternoon. Wiebren van der Zee, working for ABN AMRO, a Dutch bank, top 3 bank in the Netherlands. And we started acknowledging, and I started acknowledging sustainable IT a few years ago. 2019, I think it was, I wrote a position paper saying, well, hold on here, we cannot only look at technology, we also have to look at the impact of technology. I have this observation. I have a few friends who are architects who build houses and building offices, and they had to take sustainability into account. So where do the materials come from? How much CO2 is involved? How much energy is a building using? And I said, that's strange. All architects I know take into account sustainability aspects in their designs, but an IT architect doesn't. What is setting an IT architect aside from all the other architects? My answer was it doesn't, or it shouldn't. So it was kind of an eye-opener for me that we had to do something in this space. So we've been working on that and trying to get more clarity on how big is our footprint, like also Rainer said, and how material is it then also to the other elements of the bank's own operation. It proves also, in our case, very material, up to even above 40% of the total footprint of the bank stemming from IT operations or delivery. So if you then have targets for yourself, better not forget one of your biggest contributors to your footprint, right?
Yeah. Thank you. We'll come back to some of those metrics later. So thank you for the introduction. This morning, I know, Niklas, you travelled in late this morning, but we had IDC talk about some of the insights and trends in the market, and I spoke to a number of people in the breaks and over lunch, and one of the observations I took away was actually importance around vendor selection for cloud and how security was very top of the list, but surprisingly in certain geographies, ESG was quite low down the list. And when we've talked this morning about speed, scale of innovation, and then you talk about sustainability, it can appear to be mutually exclusive if you're not careful. So maybe kind of start the conversation, because of your good self, and you alluded in this in your introduction about you authored a book, Sustainable IT Playbook for Tech Leaders. Maybe just expand on your introduction, if you wouldn't mind, on what motivated you to publish such a book in this space.
Well, I think it's exactly that, to educate, to bring awareness, and to activate people to get started, to sort of turn the spotlight on this issue. Because I think also the good thing about this is that it's not that hard to get started with, as long as you sort of get a baseline, a good starting point, and then you can start to make educated decisions on how you provision your cloud, for example. I think Google, as an example, they have different administration settings where you can have low carbon, low cost, or low latency, for example. So I think there are also changes happening, at least what I see in Europe, where the cloud vendors are changing. Microsoft is doing heavily investments in Sweden, where there's high access to low carbon intensity, for example. So the levers are slowly moving, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you. And Rainer, you touched on that. You contributed to the book, so perhaps maybe expand a little bit on your kind of motivation to earn some royalties on Niklas's book.
Well, it was by surprise that we just found each other and by the way, I have to say that we've met for the first time today in presence. So we're working together since, what is it, nearly 3 years now.
Yeah. Wow.
We had been contributing actively in certain areas, but never met in person, so first time here. But yeah, well, the activism, as I've said at the beginning, is coming with sharing information and trying to join forces with others. I'm a huge fan of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. SDG 17 is, to me, the most important, and this is partnership for the goal. So that means wherever we can just do things together instead of everybody individually, we can speed up. And the urgency of climate crisis is all around us. We know quite well we have to speed up. So if you listen to IPCC, the World Climate Change panel, the International Panel of Climate Change, we have about 6.5 to 7 years left to really make a change. And this is something we can't do by ourselves. And therefore, to contribute in a book which is giving a fundament, exactly as Niklas said, a good starting for people who would like to maybe get some kind of first thoughts and create that baseline to then measure success, that was the best idea I've ever seen for quite a long time, because there was nothing there. And this is still by far the most comprehensive overview how to get started and what you could do concretely, how to get your own IT operated a bit more sustainable. And this was how I got attracted to contribute and to deliver a bit of my thoughts.
Thank you, Rainer. And Wiebren, I know you didn't contribute, but you've read the book, and
yeah.
I won't quiz you on that. But just, I suppose, talking around, the unique role leaders or managers can have starting that change in IT. Perhaps maybe expand on your opinions on how such leaders in IT can play a unique role in accelerating the pace of change.
Yeah, as always, if you introduce a new aspect to a certain sector or to something that was a status quo, where we were doing technology and more and more and more, and then all of a sudden you also need to factor in the effect of that technology, then it's always difficult to get the minds changed and to really get that embedded. And I think the book of Niklas and all the work in there really helps there in raising that awareness. And also, I think Niklas does a lot of road showing to not particularly sell the book, I think, Niklas, but to send the message out that this is something to factor in going forward. And I think that is very important to raise the awareness and make this a real topic in the organizations.
We touched in the introductions around starting. We'll come on to kind of metrics and success later, but I suppose a question to all of you, and maybe Niklas, you could start. For the audience and myself and others, where do you see the biggest opportunity to improve within IT? Because sometimes when you've got a perceived insurmountable mountain, the start bit is maybe the hardest piece. So where do you see, what advice would you give around starting?
Well, I would say fundamentally is to get your baseline in order to have your starting point. Because I think the starting point, depending on what sector you're in, if you're in banking, if you're manufacturing, or professional services, or if you're a tech company, that's going to be a bit different. But if we generalize a little bit in terms of some of the key opportunities, cloud and data center is definitely one of those where you can reduce your carbon footprint quite significantly just by choosing a low carbon mode for your compute power, just running exactly what you need rather than just over provisioning, so to say. Have a good way of archiving your data and take care of your data so you don't store more than you actually need. And then also there are modern architectural principles in terms of function as a service, serverless architecture and so forth that also consumes a lot less energy. The other opportunity, I would say, is around the hardware, which is the end user computers, the smartphones that we use, our servers and so forth. Just a Dell laptop, for example, is consuming 320 kilos over a 4-year life cycle. And if you extrapolate that on a company like ASSA ABLOY, that's that's 50,000 ton over a 10-year life cycle. And everyone uses computers today. So that's also a massive shift that needs to happen to not only use the assets longer, but also to make sure that when they become end of use, they also get passed on into the value chain, because there are also very reputable partners today that can refurbish them, and they can repurpose them, and they can find a second home for that asset, and even a third home for that asset. So those would be my two key areas.
Thanks, Niklas. Similar question, Rainer, to yourself. The biggest opportunity, how do you start and tackle that?
Well, there's a couple of low-hanging ones, and Niklas already pointed towards the topic of energy consumption. To me, the most low-hanging is to completely change your contracts being a company towards renewables. So if you do have still the old-fashioned type of grid mix, power providers consuming still some coal-based or fossil-based type of energy, this is the first thing you can start with. This is not too much of rocket science. It's checking with your suppliers, it's checking with your vendors, and to change your contract. So this is a first starting from my point of view. Secondly, it is taking a very good choice in your providers you would like to work together with. Are they following the same values like what you do? And this is another one where you can just take a big influence into, and being in a company does have for sure the attendance then on the supplier side as well to get listened to. And if you do have a straightforward type of a value setting based, they will most likely follow. And to me, the third one is, well, we in such kind of a role, what we have mostly are being treated as the aspirine of the company. With us, sustainability doesn't hurt that much anymore. The problem comes with if there is still everybody continuing to do what they've done in the past, there is not a chance at all for just an individual couple of people like we are to change. So what we have to do is we have to spread the word. We have to get our colleagues and our employees within our companies following us and contributing. And finally, there is already a huge amount of people who would love to but don't have any clue how. And so if we hand them some kind of ideas and structure and steer towards a target setting, and exactly as Niklas said, if you have a baseline, if you have a clear target setting, you can steer the activism, the grassroots within your company to support you with that, and then you multiply immediately within your company. So therefore, a community building aspect is, to me, one of the most important ones.
And do you see that interest in that kind of community aspect or helping educate employees, staff, as a key part of all of your roles, I suppose, as leaders?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And what about yourself, Wiebren, from an ABN AMRO perspective?
I recognize the community building that Rainer said. We've done that also. We now have a community of 150 people within the bank joining on this topic and want to contribute. Typically, we also have a lot of the young people joining because they also want to contribute. It's their future. Well, it's also ours, but it's also even mostly more theirs. So it's also attracting a lot of the young people who want to be involved on this topic and want to contribute. And further on the measures you can take, we've seen CI/CD pass by, and I typically like to add CR to that. So CI, CD, CR, where CR stands for continuous right sizing. And I think we have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of designs that are highly scalable nowadays, and we should also use them that way. Yeah? So they really scale up and down resource-wise. And if they scale down, they should also scale down immediately and not a few weeks later, and scale down as low as they can go, basically. By turning it really off and when possible, and spinning it up when needed. So the resource dynamic, I think, is really important that we show that and use that to drive down the footprint.
Thank you, excellent. This morning we heard from IDC, I wrote down a comment around CEO fatigue on spend around certain kind of the problems we talked about, specifically security as an example, and the importance of not just time to market, but also return on investment or metrics around such investment. So with something as big a topic as sustainable IT, if you're going to make such time or commitments and investment as an organization, measuring that success and having those metrics is going to be fundamental to bring the change or accelerate the change. So Niklas, maybe I could start with you, because I'm aware for you, all of your roles on sustainablit.org, there's a first ever set of standards that you've kind of put together along with other members of the organization to try and put some impact around energy consumption, savings, emissions, waste. So taking it back to your organizations, or maybe advice to the audience, what metrics do you believe each of you, and I'll let you all speak, are the most fundamental to measuring success?
I think from our starting point, we acquire 20 companies a year, so we're a very acquisitive business. So literally, I inherit 20 ERP systems a year. So we have roughly 250 ERP systems, 400 HR systems. So application rationalization is obviously fundamental for us, not only obviously for sustainability, but also to improve our operations.
Yep.
and visibility of data. Cost is obviously a big factor to that. But then when it comes to particular metrics regarding sustainable IT, I would say obviously the overall CO2 emissions, the full dashboard in terms of what we can measure, what we can grasp. But then we'll drill down and double click on sort of energy consumption from our data centers, our end user equipment. We look at the embodied carbon, which is sort of the carbon that you sort of inherit when you buy an IT asset like a smartphone or a computer, because that is probably the biggest challenge long term. I think we can do quite a bit of opportunities in terms of reducing the CO2 emissions for data centers and cloud computing and so forth. But long term, we also need to change the ways in terms of how we consume our assets, because it's not sustainable in the way we do it today. We need to introduce a lot more circularity. We need to use a lot more non-virgin material in the assets that we are utilizing.
And Niklas, just before we move to Rainer, the data you talked about and the visibility of the metrics you're collecting, how do you socialize or educate the business? Because I think one of you said around, well, I think it was yourself, a new laptop or, the impact to the environment around that, people like me wanting the latest and greatest. How do you use that data to educate, I suppose, those metrics?
Well, I think that the fundamental thing about sustainability is that you need to create better choices for people that are not just only more sustainable, but also better in that sense. So what we do in terms of awareness is that in our service catalog, for example, we also write out not only the cost for those IT assets, but we also write out what the CO2 emissions are for those assets. And if you buy a refurbished phone, for example, it can be an iPhone 13 and even an iPhone 14, for example, then you're going to be net neutral buying that asset, for example. Or if you buy a Fairphone, for example, a Dutch company, which give you 5-year warranty, the phone itself is 100% modular. So if you drop it, you can change the screen yourself, you can change the camera, you can upgrade the battery and so forth. So I think those are the type of solutions we need, which are a lot more modular, where you can upgrade some of the latest and greatest technology. Because if you look at an iPhone 14, essentially, it's really only the camera that's been upgraded in terms of if you go under the hood.
Good insight. Rainer, back to my original question in terms of the metrics that are most important and fundamental to Allianz Technology.
Well, from everything what Niklas just said, I think transparency is key. As long as you do not know what the value is and what the meaning of what your day-to-day decisions are for in regard of environmental impact, you don't have any chance to change and to adapt to that. And as soon as you do have transparency, which always comes with data, so one of the aspects for us quite of importance is travel. We are a global company. We have 159,000 employees worldwide. Only Allianz Technology is in 32 countries, so we have a huge amount of business trips. If you do have transparency of what that business trip is accounting in regard of carbon emissions and price as well, then you do have a chance to adapt and to change. And maybe you can take a train from Berlin to Munich instead of taking a flight. And this is where I think from our perspective, the transparency is the key lever to then change and to adapt. Another thing is digitalization for sure in regard of paper consumption. As said already, there's a huge amount of paper which is being used for printing contracts and the HABs of the typical requirements from governments. And so therefore, if you can change that and put everything into digital and make digital by default an aspect, and you can measure that clearly, then there is definitely a huge impact. And
excellent.
Beside that, for us, it's quite of importance, exactly as Niklas mentioned, to look into refurbishment rates, recycling rates, remanufacturing rates of equipment. So we do have 6 own-operated data centers. We have still somehow a huge amount of servers and devices which are operated, roughly 4,000 in our own data centers. And therefore, there is a huge amount of equipment being constantly changed. And what we here have to measure is clearly the remanufacturing rate, the refurbishment rate, that we do not waste any kind of resources.
Thanks, Rainer. Wiebren, and your ABN AMRO perspective on where you're kind of starting with the fundamental metrics, how are you taking that task on?
Yeah, we've done a few things measuring. We started with life cycle analysis. So a modeled approach, difficult, how complete is the model and how reliable is then the outcome. But you have to start somewhere, so we've done that a few times, calculating the overall IT-wide carbon emissions. Then we moved on to a more near real-time approach, where we have 2,500 plus applications, and all applications now have an electricity metric, near real time, showing how much kilowatt hours they are using and how much CO2 they are emitting that go with it. And with that data-drivenness, we can also then go to the responsible product owner or DevOps team that's involved and say, well, you're in the top 25 energy consumption-wise or carbon emission-wise. What can we do about that? Or you're one of the steep rises in the landscape. And we are now setting KPIs on individual workloads, as well as overarching our KPIs on energy reductions. So that data-drivenness data transparency and drivenness is really key, I think, to also go into the IT organization. Otherwise, it stays a little bit of a kind of some people talking about sustainable IT or some management having responsibilities, and then all of the 8,000 developers and platform engineers in our organization say, well, I'm just doing my thing. No, we're bringing it to their level, and we're giving them responsibilities to steer on this. And we incentivize them. Maybe we'll start pricing, putting pricing on top, or maybe we do a more incentivizing approach. But we're bringing the transparency to the product owners and the development teams themselves. So no more excuse not to take it seriously. Yeah.
And if I may add one thing,
please,
if you just allow, one thing which is quite of importance, I think, if you just take the three of us sitting here, the companies we're working for, none of them is quite famous to be an attractive employer. And if you take about Gen Z, who is now coming from universities, trying to find jobs, we are already lacking of people in certain areas, in particular in IT. And I mean, now it is about showing real action towards that generation, that this is an attractive way of working and they can take a contribution to what is being done in regard of sustainability. So to focus into talent attraction, to focus into application rates of how much open positions are left, how much maybe dual study positions are left at the end of the year, this is something which we closely measure now as well. And this is by far one of the most important things from my point of view, where sustainability kicks heavily in, because that generation, exactly as you said it earlier, Wiebren, that is not accepting anymore that there is companies not being interested in sustainability, not taking care on the future.
You make a really good point there. I was going to come on to maybe some of the big obstacles, challenges, and maybe the cynics in the room who felt, can we really drive change? And the talent war, for want of a better word, you talk about, or attraction of talent, is rife anyway, especially in the developer world. But to your point, and what I'm hearing is that's an opportunity for organisations to use driving change around sustainability to attract great talent to your organisation as a differentiator, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I recently recruited for a head of enterprise architecture, which is typically a very, very hard role to find and to fill as part of my management team. I had 45 applicants, and out of that, I probably could have hired 25 of them right off the bat. So I think just by working with this and bringing attention, we see a big uplift in talent attractiveness, for sure.
I'm going to go back to yourself. You talked about empowerment just then, in terms of, I suppose, linked to that education and helping staff. How successful or important is empowerment to overcome maybe some of the biggest challenges you see within your organisation for driving change?
And then you mean empowerment for us or for the product owners?
Yeah,
or
the
for
example
other
you gave
roles?
was developers and the product owners, so that empowerment piece. I'm kind of asking the question in the context of where you see the biggest challenges, and that seemed like a good example where you're trying to overcome maybe inertia.
Yeah, so there's the culture thing, but I think by now everybody is aware of the problems we're facing, right? So that awareness is a little bit behind us, and we're also now looking at the tangible things we can do. So that starts with your as-is, knowing where you are and what kind of trends you show that I just talked about. And then the next thing is, well, what can I do? What are best practices? What are tactics that I can apply? Niklas wrote a lot down in his book, but there's more. And we're doing a lot of research with other institutes and other places also, and trying to really get those tactics together in a repository and hand that to the different stages of IT delivery or different roles within IT. So if you're a product owner, or if you're a Java developer, do these things. If you can do this in your pipeline. Have you say I have a code quality step in there? Can there be rules that you check that say something about the energy efficiency of the code you've just entered? And so there are multiple stages where you can really challenge the energy efficiency or the energy use of an application or of software. And so I think that these are, and the tactics to hand out to them, and the tools to hand out to the people working are I think is a good approach there. Excellent. And we have to kind of get all that knowledge together, right? So I think that's also sustainableIT.org, and we have a similar organization in the Netherlands that I'm in the board of. I think a lot of those institutes have a challenge getting all that knowledge, all those best practices and tactics together, so they can all be leveraged to the maximum, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Rain, I know you're less than a year in your new organisation, so honeymoon period's over. So what about for yourself now coming in to drive or lead change? Where are you seeing the biggest obstacles or challenges now you're more embedded into Allianz Technology?
Well, first of all, being fast enough, because, I mean, whatever we have to do it fast, and there is no chance to wait. I mean, one of the reasons I've joined sustainableIT.org was that it is a bit more and let me say that without being biased, the American way to come out quite quick with marketing and don't wait until the last end. And this is what we mostly have the tendency here in Europe, to develop something until the last dot and just then come up.
Perfection.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And that is something which we shouldn't do. I mean, we do have to develop, and we have to take that journey together, and we have to start journeying and enhancing each other. And that is something which is quite the same here in Allianz. So I do have a huge amount of people who are quite interested. I have to steer them right and accordingly to a target setting which is not fulfilling into only one angle. So that's the next challenge which comes across. We have mostly the tendency to just channel it to one aspect and maybe a carbon tunnel focusing on purely energy consumption, but it is a way more complex thing. The next challenge comes, and this is again in Allianz something, we are a global company. And I mean, carbon emissions and the climate crisis is a global issue, but we mostly have the tendency to look at it from our perspective. Yeah. So to point fingers towards India or to China, why the hell are they burning coal? Well, there might be a different situation for them. If there is 70% households without energy and they are using coal for heating and for cooking, there might be a different reason than what we are doing here in Germany, for example. So to create an understanding, a global understanding for a global problem, speed up in delivering results and making things happen and get into that transformational process. So this is the biggest challenge which I'm still facing after 9 months now nearly.
I like your answer around the globalization piece. It's very easy in Western parts of the world. We've had our industrial revolution. It didn't happen at the same time in this all around the world, right? So we've had the benefits of that, and maybe some of the developing world haven't, which makes that global complexity, global clash maybe even more complex.
Yeah, and in addition, I mean, if you just take an example of products, electronic components, where are they produced? 99% comes from China. Yeah. So if you just point fingers towards China saying, well, those poor guys, why don't they do that? Well, because we demand. So that is something which has a huge interconnection here as well. And we have to lead by example. We have to show that you can be sustainable, that the future of business can be sustainable and less harming and still profitable. And as soon as we do, I'm pretty sure that all the other economies will follow. And so therefore, transparency, again, is key.
And Niklas, like, similar question yourself, how are you tackling those obstacles you may be facing at ASSA ABLOY?
Well, I think the positive thing is that we've set goals internally in terms of science-based target initiative, where we're going to halve our emissions by 2030 and be net neutral no later than 2050. And we had a leadership summit for our top 100 leaders a few weeks back, and one of the key topics we were talking about and what we are doing is creating sustainable business opportunities. I think we have a great example here in London actually with Bishopsgate, which is a building which is a net positive building or close to net zero, where we've been part of that journey. We see great opportunities similar to that to be part and contribute. Our biggest challenge as a company is really how can we introduce circularity in terms of our material, in terms of aluminum, in terms of steel. If we can reuse aluminum, we can reduce our carbon footprint by 90% because it's so carbon intense to create aluminum, and the same goes for steel.
Wow.
I think it becomes a scaling game because the demand and the supply for renewable steel is not there yet. But you also see the car manufacturing business, for example, they're taking a lot of big bets and buying up a lot of this demand at the moment. So I think there's a bit of challenge in terms of how can we introduce this new energy, new industry with utilizing low carbon energy or renewable energy. I think that's the challenge as well, while we are transitioning.
Thank you. I know we have a few more minutes left, but before we wrap up, a couple other questions, and if we have time, if people in the audience want to pose a couple of questions, I'd encourage you to have a think if you would like to take opportunity. I know Soraya will keep an eye on time for me, so I may not be able to get to everyone, and we do have a mic that can go around if you have any questions, better questions than I've posed to the panel. If not, I think the majority of Niklas and Rainer and Wiebren will be around later on. I know if I speak to Jed about investments, he wants a return on that investment. Is there a return on investment on this topic around sustainable IT? And I suppose linked to that, how do you avoid the trap that of maybe certain media outlets would call around greenwashing or false promises, especially in your organizations? Maybe Niklas, you want to take that one first?
Sure. No, I think, like I mentioned, we acquire 20 companies a year, so we have 2,500 plus applications. So obviously for us to reduce the number of applications is a key imperative in terms of reducing cost, reducing the number of data storage, local data centers, and moving to the cloud and so forth. So we don't really see that impact in terms of cost when it comes to application rationalization, rationalizing our infrastructure, and so forth. Where I see the biggest challenge is really regarding the hardware that we buy in terms of the end user equipment. We can probably find ways to halve our impact in terms of CO2 emissions in the next 10 years. But unless we can get the vendors like HP, Lenovo, Dell, and so forth to reduce the impact of CO2 emission when they create these products to start, then we're not going to get to net zero. And that's probably where we're going to have the challenge with the return on investment, not on the cloud and data center.
Rainer, similar question, the return on investment, but also those false promises. How do you avoid that pitfall?
Well, let me start maybe with the business of what we have as an insurance company. We do have, damages which we're regulating as an insurance company, and the more the damages get, the more expensive an insurance will be, and at the end, there is probably no business anymore. And if you take current numbers, we've had regulations of 190 billion in last year for all insurance companies worldwide, which had been clearly indicated to climate change and some strong weather results. The perception is that we go up to 900 to 950 billion within the next 6 to 7 years. So that means, independent of return on invest, there is no alternative than to change and to adapt. If we just don't do anything, the business of an insurance company will be gone in 15 to 20 years. So that's the first. Secondly, well, if you take it to IT where we are, my biggest return on invest is that I do have purpose with what I do. Because, I mean, if you just take us as IT companies, we don't get phone calls from people thanking us for everything is working today. What do we get? We get incidents and outages and everything is slow. So as soon as you change and you get something which creates purpose, and this is always happening if you have sustainability somehow adapted within your role, independently of where that is, then you get a value which is, at the end of the day, at least somehow thankful. And that can be societal, it can be technical, it can be energy consumption aspects. So whatever you do, it creates purpose, and that is then just something for ourselves. At the end, it's all about people and human beings, and so therefore, this is, to me, the biggest return on investment.
Absolutely. And finally, for your good self, Wiebren.
Yeah, I've talked about continuous right-sizing earlier. That has obviously also a cost effect in resources you don't have to spin up or you spin down quickly. Also has a cost effect, but that's more the technical side. There's also an image side, not to go into the greenwashing, but indeed you cannot, as a bank, we are getting more strict on what we want to fund. We have to practice also what we preach to our clients, right? So we also have to look under our own hood and lower our own impact. So the return on investment is on different areas, and overall it is because of our own future, of course, and of our children. So that's even the most important, I would say. And I always use a slogan nowadays within the bank that if an IT transformation is not leading to a lowered impact, it's actually not the right transformation. And that may sound obvious, but I think we're still doing a lot of transformations that add to the problem and not reduce the problem.
Yeah.
So you get my drift, right?
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, any questions from the audience that anyone would like to pose to one of the panelists?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
No need to. There's
Thank
one.
you. I think there's a microphone coming towards you, if that helps, so everyone can hear.
Is this working? Yes.
Yes.
As in your positions, what tools do you see getting together with partners to enable everybody to realize that those goals, other than science-based targets, but in manufacture of realization of the products in IT, what tools have we actually got to measure them in realization of it? So is it an ISO standard that's being formulated? We don't have metrics to know what the carbon generation is of an iPhone 14 and what the component parts are. So is there somewhere that is actually documented, shared, so we can actually really measure what the impact is for everybody?
Well, so there is a couple of standards. One of them is in sustainableIT.org, so that is something which you all should look into. So there is defined standards. But towards the question, what you said, embodied carbon emissions is standardized meanwhile. So if you go to the big vendors, independently of its smartphones or laptops or server components, all of that is measured with a PIA standard. And behind that, there is a clear and transparent metric, which is including the raw materials, the manufacturing part, the usage part, the transport, and as well then the end of life of that product. So exactly as Niklas mentioned, with the 360 kilos, that is including all of that, and this is measured with a standard. If it comes to sourcing, as a company, what we've done is we've developed our own KPIs, which is then being put into tenders and RFPs and RFIs, which is ensuring not only simple yes or no questions, but as well then with a span. So from 0 means nothing to 100, which is 100% fulfilled. And this is then giving at least one number in addition to surveys and to price tags. And this is what we already do since quite a year now in Allianz and in Siemens as well. So this is something we had to develop ourselves.
Thank you for the question. I know we're over time, and I could carry on. Soraya's telling me to get off stage. Josh, you did have a question. I'm going to...
I would say very low-hanging fruit is use your devices longer. So in the end-user device, the laptops, the phones, if we start using them longer and not go for the latest and the greatest, we already reduce the impact a lot. Maybe we also reduce the sales of some companies, but we certainly reduce the impact.
Yeah. And Rainer, Niklas, do you want to briefly answer Josh's question as well?
Well, I think that's an excellent, to add on to Wiebren, I would say find a reputable partner that can also extend the lifetime of that device when it becomes end of use. There are some good ones out there for sure that can give you good transparency, that can give you good carbon accounting on the assets that you give them. The worst case examples I've seen is when you hand something in and you just get a receipt saying that, yes, we have destroyed your assets, and there's no traceability on where they went. So find a good reputable partner in the IT asset disposition industry to work with.
And Rainer, I'll give you as the activist in the suit the final closing comment.
Well, I would say demand within your own companies to take part in change and in transformation. Speak up, ask your headquarters, ask your C-suite what is really happening, if they are taking things serious or if they don't. And if they don't, demand that it is being taken serious, because all change comes with a clear guidance and with a clear backing from the management and from the C-suite. If they don't follow it, if they don't take it serious, then you mostly end up in greenwashing, and it's only purely marketing and not changing anything. So therefore, demand to be part of the change.
Good advice. Gentlemen, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I hope the audience have too. For those interested in sustainablet.org, it's a non-profit organisation. You can speak to Jed, to Josh, who are here today, or to any of the members of the board. We're looking for active recruits, or SITR, to drive change in our industries and across the planet. So you're more than welcome to grab a coffee and a drink in the breaks on that front. With that, please join me in giving a massive round of applause. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for coming today.